The wind in Pine Ridge had a way of getting under a person's skin. It was not a gentle breeze that whispered through the cottonwoods, but a raw, persistent force that scoured the land, carrying with it the fine, silver dust from the high plains. It was a wind that made a person feel small and temporary. Abigail Hale had lived with that wind for 5 years, but in the week since her husband Tom had been buried, it seemed to have found new ways to sound lonely. It rattled the window panes of the small ranch house with a hollow insistence, a constant reminder of the empty space beside her in the bed, the silence where his heavy footfalls used to be. At 28, Abigail was not a stranger to hard work. Her hands, though clean, bore the faint maps of calluses from gripping reins, mending fences, and helping with the difficult birth of a calf. She had a practical mind, one that understood the unforgiving arithmetic of ranching. She could look at a field of wheat and estimate its yield, could read a sky and know if it promised rain or ruin. It was this practicality that kept her moving now, through the haze of grief. She baked bread not because she was hungry, but because the dough needed to be kneaded. She mended a tear in Tom's work shirt, the familiar scent of horse and sweat rising from the fabric, a ghost in the quiet room. Tom had been a man of grand dreams and shaky foundations. He had loved this land with a fierce passion, but his optimism had always outpaced his profits. He died as he had lived, chasing something in a storm, a sudden dust squall on the North Range. They said his horse, spooked by the blinding grit, had thrown him. By the time the storm cleared and the search party found him, it was too late. He had left her with a half-finished barn, a herd of cattle that needed better winter feed, and the chilling realization that his dreams had been built on borrowed money. The extent of that debt was a number she was still trying to lock down in the pages of the ledger he kept so poorly. The town of Pine Ridge lay 2 miles down a rutted track, a small collection of wooden buildings huddled against the vastness of the prairie. It was a place held together by necessity and the twice-weekly whistle of the Northern Pacific train. The telegraph line was its fragile link to the outside world, a connection that crackled and faded with the same moody unpredictability as the weather. When Abigail rode her mare into town, she could feel the eyes on her. Conversations on the boardwalk of the Dry Gulch Saloon would drop to a murmur. Heads would turn. They were not unkind people, not truly, but their sympathy was laced with a thick thread of morbid curiosity. A young widow, they whispered among themselves. A mountain of debt. They speculated. She held her head high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, pretending not to hear the conjectures that swirled in her wake like the dust her horse kicked up. The saloon was the town's unofficial news office, and she knew her life was the current headline. She saw Sheriff Eli Barrett standing outside the marshal's office. He was not a large man. In fact, he was shorter than most, with a wiry frame that seemed made of little more than sinew and bone. He moved with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, the legacy of a gunfight 3 years prior that had left him with a piece of lead permanently lodged in his thigh. He was a man of few words, known for a quiet, unshakable fairness that had earned him a measure of respect even from the rowdier elements in the territory. He met her eyes as she passed and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of pity, but of acknowledgement. Abigail nodded back, appreciating the simple dignity of the exchange. Her destination was the Mercantile, run by Sadie Quinn, a woman whose sharp tongue was matched only by her loyalty. Inside, the air smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and bolts of calico. Sadie looked up from behind the counter, her expression softening. She said, "Abigail, it is good to see you out." Abigail forced a small smile. She answered that a person cannot stay inside forever. Flour and salt, Sadie, and a bit of coffee. As Sadie measured out the goods, she spoke in a low voice. She told Abigail to pay no mind to the gossips. Their tongues are the only part of them that gets any exercise. Abigail's throat felt tight. She murmured her thanks. It was a small kindness, but it felt like a warm stone in the cold river of her mourning. She paid for her supplies, her mind already on the figures in the ledger, subtracting this small expense from a dwindling sum. On her way out of town, she stopped at the small post office, which was little more than a corner of the marshal's building. The clerk, a young man with a nervous twitch, handed her a single envelope. It was thick, official-looking, with the return address of the Crowley Bank of Pine Ridge printed in stark black ink. A cold dread, sharper than the autumn wind, settled in her stomach. She knew what it was before she opened it. She waited until she was back at the ranch, sitting at the rough-hewn kitchen table Tom had built. The seal broke with a crisp tear that sounded unnaturally loud in the silent house. The language of the letter was cold and precise, stripped of all sentiment. It spoke of loan agreements, of missed payments, of clauses and subclauses. The final paragraph was a blade. It stated that if the full outstanding debt was not paid within 10 days of the date of receipt, the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings on the Hale property. Every acre, every head of cattle, the house itself, everything. The paper trembled in her hand. 10 days. It was an impossible timeline. The cattle were not ready for market. The price of grain was low, and the small savings she had were meant to last her through the winter. The number printed on the page was staggering, far more than she had calculated. There were fees and interest charges that Tom had never mentioned. Her grief, a dull and heavy ache, was suddenly pierced by a sharp spear of anger. Anger at Tom for his secrets and his failures. Anger at Silas Crowley, the banker, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Anger at this unyielding land that gave with one hand and took with the other. But beneath the anger was a deeper, colder current of fear. This ranch was all she had. It was the place where she had built a life, however difficult. The thought of losing it, of being turned out with nothing, was a physical blow. She felt a wave of dizziness and gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. She took a long, shaky breath, the scent of dust and old wood filling her lungs. The wind howled outside, a desolate cry that echoed the hollowness inside her. She looked at the letter again, the black ink stark against the white page. 10 days. Her practical mind, the part of her that was a survivor, began to stir. Panic would not help. Anger would not pay the bills. She had to think. She had to act. She pushed the letter aside and pulled the heavy ledger toward her. She opened it to a fresh page, dipped her pen in the inkwell, and began to write. Her script neat and controlled. A list of assets, a list of debts. The numbers were grim, the odds overwhelming. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie, Abigail made a decision. She would not hide, she would not run. She would ride back into Pine Ridge on Monday morning and she would face Silas Crowley. She did not know what she would say or what she could possibly offer, but she would not let him take her home. Her life without a fight. Her dignity was the one thing the bank could not foreclose on. She looked out the window at the vast, darkening landscape. The wind had not died down. It was a constant presence, a reminder of the forces that could wear a person down to nothing. But in that windy land, she thought, warmth had to come from people. From the quiet nod of a fair-minded sheriff, from the gruff kindness of a friend, and sometimes it had to come from a fire lit within oneself, a stubborn flame refusing to be extinguished by the cold. She had 10 days to see if that flame was enough. The lamp on the kitchen table burned through the night, its yellow glow a small island in an ocean of darkness. Abigail Hale sat before it, the ledger open, her pen scratching against the paper in the otherwise silent house. The wind had died down, leaving a profound quiet that felt heavier than any storm. She worked with a grim determination, her mind a flurry of numbers. The principal of the loan was a formidable sum on its own. To this she added the accrued interest, calculated at a rate that felt punitive, a punishment for misfortune. Then came the lawyer's fees, a figure that Silas Crowley's letter had mentioned with casual cruelty. She added the columns again and again, hoping for a mistake, a miscalculation that would shrink the total into something manageable. But the numbers did not lie. Each time, the final sum was the same, a monolithic figure that stood as a tombstone for her future on this land. The harvest had been poor, a dry summer followed by an early frost that had withered a third of the wheat. The money she had would not see her through the winter, let alone satisfy a debt of this magnitude. It was an impossible sum. She finally put the pen down, the ink staining her fingertips. Leaning back in her chair, she felt the bone-deep weariness that comes not from labor, but from hopelessness. The first light of dawn was a pale, gray wash against the window pane, offering no warmth, only the signal that a day she dreaded had begun. She had not slept when the sharp, authoritative knock came at the door. It startled her, a sound too solid for the ghosts she had been wrestling with. She smoothed her hair, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs, and went to the door. Sheriff Eli Barrett stood on her porch, his hat in his hands. The rising sun cast his wiry frame in a long silhouette. His face was etched with a seriousness that went beyond a simple morning call. He said, "Ma'am, I apologize for the early hour." Abigail clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She replied that it was no matter. She had been awake. The sheriff's gaze was direct. He told her he was on his patrol and noticed something. He needed to ask about some strange boot prints around her horse barn. He described them as belonging to 2, maybe 3 men, and they were not fresh, likely from late last night. He added that they were not hers or her husband's. A new kind of cold, different from the chill of her financial dread, seeped into her bones. The vague whispers about Whit Maddox and his band of ruffians, who were known to prowl the less settled parts of the territory, suddenly felt less like saloon gossip and more like a tangible threat. She was a woman alone on an isolated ranch. The thought was a sharp, physical jab of fear. She could only manage to say that she had heard nothing. Eli nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the property behind her. He advised her to keep a sharp eye. He said he would ask around in town, see if anyone else saw strangers out this way. Then his tone softened slightly. He asked if she was still planning on going to the bank this morning. She confirmed she was. He paused, then said he had some business near there himself. He offered to ride along, if she did not mind the company. It was not a question of propriety. It was a quiet offer of support, a shield. Abigail, who had been determined to face this alone, found herself accepting. The boot prints had changed the equation. An hour later, they rode into Pine Ridge. The town was coming to life, the blacksmith's hammer ringing a steady rhythm in the crisp air. Abigail was acutely aware of the sheriff riding beside her, a silent, limping guardian. His presence did not stop the curious stares, but it seemed to temper them, holding the whispers at bay. The Crowley Bank was the most imposing building on the main street, made of brick instead of wood, with large glass windows that seemed to look out on the town with an air of cold judgment. Inside, the air was still and smelled of polish and old paper. A young clerk with slicked-back hair peered at them through a brass grill. Silas Crowley emerged from a back office, a practiced smile on his face. He was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed. He exuded an air of prosperous civility. He greeted Abigail with a tone of deep condolence that felt utterly false, then acknowledged the sheriff with a nod that was both respectful and dismissive. He ushered them into his office. The room was dominated by a large mahogany desk, polished to a mirror shine. He gestured for Abigail to sit in a leather chair that was clearly designed to make a person feel small. Eli remained standing by the door, his presence a quiet, watchful weight in the room. Crowley began with a long preamble about his deep respect for her late husband and his own reluctance to be the bearer of bad news. Abigail let him speak, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had not come for platitudes. Finally, He got to the point. He spread his soft, uncalloused hands on the desk. He explained that, given the circumstances and the size of the outstanding loan, the bank was left with little choice. However, he said, because of his high regard for her, he was prepared to offer a solution. His solution was this: she would sign over the deed to the majority of the ranch land, the pastures, the wheat fields, and the barn. The bank would consider this a partial settlement of the debt. In return, as an act of Christian charity, he would allow her to retain ownership of the house itself and the small 1-acre plot it stood on. He presented it as a lifeline, a generous act of mercy. Abigail saw it for what it was: a cage. He was offering her a home with no way to sustain it, a house with no life. She would be trapped, impoverished, and entirely at his mercy. Her voice was low but steady when she spoke. She told him that was not a solution. That was a sentence. Crowley's smile thinned. He sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. It was then that he played his final, cruel card. He said that perhaps she was not aware of the full nature of Tom's financial arrangements. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a second, smaller ledger, one Abigail had never seen. He opened it on the desk. He explained that these were separate, private loans, cash loans, made at a much higher rate of interest, with no collateral. He tapped a finger on a series of entries. The payments were irregular, made in cash, and recorded with only a single initial, W.M. Abigail stared at the page, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. The dates corresponded with times Tom had been short of funds, times he had been moody and secretive. Crowley's voice was smooth as oiled leather. He explained that her husband was under a great deal of pressure. He was paying for protection. You see, a man like Whit Maddox requires certain assurances to ensure a ranch remains peaceful and its cattle do not wander off. The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Extortion. Tom had been paying off a common outlaw. The secret shame of it, the weakness of it, rose in her throat like bile. This was not just a story of bad luck and poor harvests. This was something sordid, something cowardly. She looked up at Crowley, her voice trembling with a fierce, protective denial. She insisted he was not a coward. Crowley gave a small, indifferent shrug. He simply stated that a debt is a debt. The bank had absorbed these private loans to consolidate the account. It was all perfectly legal. All this time, Eli had remained silent, his expression unreadable. Now? He spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the polished civility of the room. He asked for a 48-hour delay. He said he would like to look into the legality of these so-called private loans. For the first time, a flicker of annoyance crossed Crowley's face. He looked at the sheriff, his eyes cold. He refused, stating that there was nothing to investigate. The paperwork was in order. The foreclosure notice was legal and binding. He gave a faint, dismissive smile and added that the law was on his side. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of dust and shattered memories. Abigail felt hollowed out, as if some vital part of her had been carved away. The man she had loved and mourned was now a stranger, a man who had hidden a deep and shameful secret from her. As they reached the turnoff to her property, Eli reined in his horse. He looked at her, his gaze steady and serious. He said to her quietly that what Crowley described was not a loan, it was extortion. And if that was the case, it was a criminal matter, not a civil debt. The words hung in the air between them, a fragile thread of possibility in the wreckage of her day. It was hope, but it came at a cost. To pursue it meant admitting the truth about Tom. It meant placing her fate in the hands of another man, relying on his strength, his authority. She thanked him for the escort, her voice strained. He nodded and turned his horse back toward town, leaving her alone with the terrible knowledge and the even more terrible choice. She walked into the empty house, the second ledger, which Crowley had insisted she take, feeling like a lead weight in her saddlebag. The shame she felt for Tom was a bitter poison. But a new, fierce resolve was beginning to form. Tom's secret debt had made her feel as though her life, her home, her very dignity had been bought and paid for with dirty money. All without her consent. She would not let it happen again. Accepting the sheriff's help felt like another kind of debt, a debt of gratitude that could be just as binding as any loan. She had to find a way to fight this herself. She would not be bought, not by a banker's charity, and not by a lawman's protection. She had to own herself, free and clear. But as the prairie wind began to rise again, whispering its lonely song around the corners of the house, she did not know how. The smell of smoke woke her. It was not the familiar, comforting scent of the wood stove, but something acrid and hungry. Abigail Hale's eyes snapped open in the darkness. An unnatural orange light flickered against the bedroom window, dancing with a wild, menacing energy. For a heart-stopping second, she thought the house was on fire. She threw off the quilt and ran to the window, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor. The fire was outside, the massive haystack near the barn, the result of a summer's hard labor and her primary winter feed for the cattle, was a raging inferno. Flames leaped high into the night sky, a roaring, crackling beast consuming her future one bale at a time. The wind, which had been so quiet, had returned with a vengeance, whipping the flames into a frenzy and carrying burning embers toward the dry timbers of the barn. Panic seized her for a moment, a cold, paralyzing grip. Then, the ingrained practicality of a rancher's wife took over. She pulled on her boots and a heavy coat over her nightdress, her mind racing. She grabbed the 2 largest buckets from the washroom and ran outside into the heat and chaos. The air was thick with smoke that burned her lungs and made her eyes water. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall she had to force herself to push through. She worked with a frantic, desperate rhythm, running to the water pump, her arms straining as she worked the handle, filling the buckets with a pathetic stream of water, and then running back to throw the contents at the base of the fire. It was like trying to put out the sun with a teacup. The water hissed into steam, swallowed instantly by the blaze. She was so consumed by her futile effort that she did not hear the horse until it was nearly upon her. A dark shape galloped into the yard, and Sheriff Eli Barrett swung down from the saddle before the horse had even come to a full stop. He had seen the glow from town. He took in the scene with a quick, practiced eye, the wind whipping sparks past his face. He yelled over the roar of the flames, telling her to get wet blankets from the house and to douse the side of the barn. He said he would try to keep the fire from spreading. His presence, his calm command in the face of chaos, was a steadying force. Abigail ran back to the house, her lungs screaming for clean air. She returned with 2 heavy wool blankets, soaking them at the pump before dragging them to the barn. 2 other riders had arrived, ranch hands from a neighboring property, drawn by the same terrible beacon in the night. Eli directed them, their movements efficient and coordinated. They formed a bucket brigade, a desperate line of defense against the relentless fire. Abigail worked alongside them, her body aching, her face smeared with soot. The world shrank to the heat, the smoke, and the rhythmic slosh of water. At one point, she found herself next to Eli, both of them coughing, their eyes red and streaming. He grumbled, his voice raspy, telling her not to breathe too deep. Through a hacking cough, she retorted that he could breathe her share for me then. A ghost of a smile touched his soot-stained lips, a brief moment of shared humanity in the middle of the disaster. The formal barrier between the grieving widow and the town sheriff dissolved in the smoke. They were just 2 people fighting a common enemy. They fought for what felt like hours, a losing battle against the fire and the wind. The haystack was a total loss, a mountain of black, smoldering ruin. But they managed to save the barn. As the flames finally began to die down, their fury spent. A wagon rattled into the yard. Sadie Quinn sat on the driver's seat, her face a mask of worry. She had brought a large coffee pot and a stack of clean cloths. She climbed down and immediately took charge of Abigail, wrapping a blanket around her trembling shoulders and pressing a tin cup of hot, sweet coffee into her hands. Sadie looked at the smoldering remains of the haystack, and her lips tightened into a thin, angry line. She said that if anyone speaks ill of you after this, Abigail, you just send their bill for salt and vinegar to me. Her gruff loyalty was a balm on Abigail's raw nerves. As the first light of dawn began to creep into the sky, Eli walked slowly around the perimeter of the scorched earth. His limp was more pronounced, a sign of his exhaustion. He stopped, crouching down, his gaze fixed on the ground just beyond the circle of ash. When he straightened up, he came over to where Abigail was standing with Sadie. He told her he had found them again, the boot prints, the same ones from the other night, clear in the damp earth near the fence line where the fire had not reached. He said it was not a stray spark from a passing train. This was deliberate. This was a message from Whit Maddox. The reality of his words settled on Abigail with a crushing weight. This was not just a threat. This was an attack. They were trying to burn her out, to break her spirit. She looked at the ruin of the hay, at the weary faces of the men who had come to help, and a cold, hard anger began to replace her fear. Eli watched her, his expression grim. He told her that she could not stay here alone. Not now. He said he could post one of his deputies, but he only had 2, and one was 50 miles away on county business. He then made the offer, his voice low and serious. He said the best way was for him to stay for a few days, at least until this business was settled. He could sleep in the barn. Abigail hesitated. Her first instinct was to refuse. Her pride, her fierce need for independence, recoiled at the idea of being protected, of being seen as a helpless woman in need of a man's care. But then she looked toward the pasture, where several of her cows, heavy with calf, were beginning to gather. The calving season was upon them, the most vulnerable time of year for her herd, her only remaining asset of any real value. The boot prints, the fire, the unseen threat lurking in the shadows. All of it was a direct danger to her livelihood. This was not about her pride anymore. It was about survival. She gave a slow, reluctant nod. She told him he could use the barn, and she thanked him. Later that morning, after the neighbors had gone and a fragile quiet had settled over the ranch, Abigail went through Tom's things. She was not looking for anything in particular, just a connection, a piece of the man she thought she knew. She opened a large wooden trunk at the foot of their bed, the scent of cedar and old leather rising to meet her. Inside were his Sunday suit, a few worn books, and a small tin box. She opened the box. It contained odds and ends, a pocket knife, a few silver coins, and a small stack of papers tied with a piece of string. Most were receipts for seed and equipment, but at the bottom of the stack was a flimsy, folded piece of paper. It was a telegraph receipt from the Pine Ridge station. It was addressed to Silas Crowley. Abigail's blood ran cold when she saw the date stamped at the top. It was the day Tom had died. The message was short, just a few words. Cannot pay. He is threatening. Need help. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the flimsy paper a damning piece of evidence in her hand. Crowley had known. He had known Tom was being extorted, had known he was in danger, and he had done nothing. His feigned sympathy, his talk of Christian charity, it was all a lie. He was not just a ruthless banker. He was complicit in the criminal activity that had likely led to her husband's death. When Eli came to the house for a cup of coffee, she showed him the receipt. He read it, his expression hardening into granite. He looked from the paper to her face, seeing the new steely resolve in her eyes. He handed the receipt back to her carefully. He told her this changed things. This could be the leverage they needed. She looked at him, the weight of the last 24 hours pressing down on her. She asked him if they could win. Eli met her gaze, his own eyes reflecting the grim reality of their situation. He was not a man for easy promises. He said he did not promise they would win, but he did promise he would not quit. As he spoke, A soft drumming sound began on the roof. A sudden, unexpected rain shower had begun to fall. It was not a storm, just a gentle, steady rain. It washed the soot from the air, settled the dust on the ground, and hissed against the last glowing embers of the fire, finally extinguishing them for good. Through the window, Abigail could see the sky clearing to the west, a pale, fragile blue emerging from behind the gray clouds. It was a small thing, a brief shower on the vast prairie, but it felt like a sign, a fragile, uncertain glimmer of hope. That night, a lamp burned in the window of the small ranch house, and another one burned in the barn. The arrangement did not go unnoticed. The news traveled as fast as a prairie fire itself. By the next day, the whispers in the Dry Gulch saloon had a new edge to them. The sheriff was staying at the widow Hale's place. The words were loaded, heavy with insinuation and judgment, another kind of siege beginning to close in around her. The air on Monday morning was cold and still, holding the kind of brittle clarity that comes after a rain. Riding into Pine Ridge beside Sheriff Eli Barrett, Abigail Hale felt as though she were moving through a world made of glass, a world that might shatter at any moment. The town seemed unnaturally quiet, but she could feel the weight of eyes watching from behind curtains and in the doorways of shops. News of the fire, coupled with the open secret of the sheriff staying in her barn, had primed the town for a spectacle. Today was the 10th day. Everyone knew what that meant. The Crowley Bank was already crowded when they arrived. It seemed half the town had found an excuse to conduct business at that specific hour. They stood in small, silent groups, a gallery of witnesses gathered for a public execution of a person's life. The air was thick and warm, smelling of damp wool and anxious sweat. At the front of the room, Silas Crowley stood behind his gleaming mahogany counter, a stack of legal documents arranged neatly before him. He was a picture of smug, orderly power. He looked up as Abigail entered, a thin, triumphant smile touching his lips. He did not acknowledge the sheriff at all. Abigail walked toward the counter, her steps steady even though her knees felt weak. Eli followed a pace behind, his limp a quiet, rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic beating of her heart. He stopped near the door, his posture relaxed but his eyes missing nothing. This was her fight, and he was letting her face it, even in defeat. Crowley's voice was smooth and loud, intended for everyone in the room to hear. He said, "Good morning, Mrs. Hale. I trust you are here to finalize our arrangement. It is a sad day, but the law, you understand, is the law." He picked up a pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and held it poised over the foreclosure document. The scratching of that pen nib on paper would be the sound of her life ending. Abigail braced herself, lifting her chin, determined to meet this final blow with dignity. The front door of the bank opened again, letting in a shaft of cold, bright sunlight. The crowd shuffled and murmured. Turning to see, Eli Barrett had not moved. So it was not him, a man Abigail did not recognize. A drifter by his look, had come in and gone. The moment of distraction passed. Crowley, annoyed by the interruption, reasserted his control. He said, "Now, as I was saying..." He was stopped by the sound of the door opening once more. This time, it was not a drifter. It was Sadie Quinn, who pushed her way through the crowd to stand beside Abigail, her presence a solid, defiant statement of support. But it was the man who followed her that brought the room to a complete, stunned silence. Eli Barrett, who everyone thought was standing by the door, was no longer there. The man by the door was one of his deputies. Sheriff Eli Barrett was walking from the back room of the bank, the one marked private. He moved with his usual deliberate pace, his limp seeming more pronounced on the polished floor. He carried nothing in his hands. He walked directly to the counter, his gaze fixed on Silas Crowley. The banker's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion and alarm. Eli stopped directly in front of Crowley. He did not look at Abigail. He did not look at the crowd. He simply held out his hand toward his deputy, who stepped forward and placed a thick canvas bank bag and a small stack of papers into his palm. The sheriff placed the bag on the counter. The clink of coins, heavy and final, was the only sound in the cavernous silence. Then he laid the papers beside it. They were her loan documents. Across each one, in thick black ink, a single word was stamped: canceled. Eli looked at Crowley, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. He spoke 2 words: paid in full. A collective gasp swept through the bank. It was a wave of sound, of disbelief and shock. Silas Crowley stared at the bag of money and the stamped papers as if they were venomous snakes. His face, moments before so full of triumph, had turned a pasty, sickly white. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His power, his leverage, had vanished in the space of 2 words. Then Eli Barrett turned. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at Abigail. His eyes, usually so guarded and serious, held an expression she had never seen before, a look of profound, vulnerable sincerity. The entire room seemed to fade away, leaving only the 2 of them standing in the sudden, sharp focus of the moment. His voice was for her, but every soul in that room heard it as if it were a proclamation. He said, "Your husband died owing every penny. I paid your debts, and I am asking for your hand." The world tilted on its axis. The whispers of the crowd, the smell of the ink, the cold draft from the door. It all blurred into an incomprehensible wave of sensation. Abigail stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. He had paid the debt. He had saved her home, her life, and in the same breath, he had laid a new, impossibly heavy obligation at her feet. She felt a surge of something that was not gratitude, but a wild, desperate panic. Was this just another transaction? Was she being passed from one debt to another? From a ledger of coin to a ledger of lifelong obligation? Her voice, when she found it, was a raw, trembling whisper. "Sheriff," she said, her eyes pleading with his, "do not make me a debt once more." Eli's expression did not change. He held her gaze, his own unwavering. His voice was calm and steady, a rock in her churning sea of confusion. He replied, "I paid the debt to unbind you, Abigail, not to bind you to me. That question was a request, not a demand." The quiet sincerity of his words cut through her panic. He was not claiming her. He was offering a choice. He was giving her back the freedom that Crowley had tried to steal, and then, separately, asking if she would choose to share it with him. A sharp nudge to her ribs brought her back to the room. Sadie was beside her, her face a mixture of shock and glee. She whispered into Abigail's ear. A stage whisper loud enough for the first few rows of the crowd to hear. She said, "Well, if you say no, I will take him." The absurdity of it, the sheer, unapologetic nerve of her friend, broke the spell. A small, shaky laugh escaped Abigail's lips. It was a watery sound, but it was a laugh nonetheless, and it broke the suffocating tension in the room. Silas Crowley finally found his voice. It was a strangled, furious sound. He sputtered that this was a house of business. Money is money. This proposal has no bearing on the financial transaction. But his words were hollow. The public humiliation, the utter loss of control, was written all over his face. He had been beaten, not with laws or loopholes, but with a simple, stunning act of personal sacrifice. The crowd began to murmur again, the shock giving way to a buzz of excited speculation. They were all looking at her, waiting for her answer. She looked at Eli, at the man who had stood by her, who had fought for her, who had just laid his heart bare in front of the entire town. She owed him everything. And that was the problem. She could not say yes. Not like this. A life begun in gratitude would never be a partnership of equals. She would always feel the weight of what he had done, the ghost of this impossible debt standing between them. She took a deep breath, finding a strength she did not know she possessed. She looked directly at Eli, her voice clear and strong now. She told him she needed time. She needed to stand on her own land, under her own roof, and not feel the weight of any man's ledger. Tom's or his, she said. I need to know who I am when I am not being led by debt. A lesser man might have shown his disappointment, might have pressed his advantage. But Eli Barrett was not a lesser man. He simply nodded, a slow, accepting gesture. His eyes held a flicker of sadness, but it was overshadowed by a deep and abiding respect. He said, Then I will wait. But know this money does not buy an answer. He turned and walked toward the door, the crowd parting for him as if he were a king. Abigail stood for a moment longer, in the center of the bank, on ground that was now, impossibly, her own. She felt Sadie's arm slip around her waist, a silent, supportive anchor. She had not lost everything. She had been given a future, but it was a future she would have to build for herself, on her own terms, before she could ever truly share it with anyone. The spectacle at the bank did not quiet the town of Pine Ridge. It set it ablaze with speculation. Abigail Hale's debt was paid, but a new one, of a far more public and complicated nature, had been issued. In the days that followed, she felt the invisible currency of gossip being exchanged every time she rode into town for supplies. The whispers were no longer just about a widow's misfortune, but about a sheriff's shocking proposal and the fortune he had spent to make it. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the rhythm of the ranch. There were fences to mend, a new supply of hay to be bought and stacked, and the constant, watchful presence of Eli Barrett in her barn. He had not moved back to his rooms in town. The fire and the boot prints were a crime scene, he had explained, and the investigation was ongoing. It was a plausible reason, but they both knew it was more than that. His presence was a silent shield against the threat of Whit Maddox, yet that same shield made her a target for the town's wagging tongues. Eli, for his part, was not idle. The debt was a civil matter, now settled, but the extortion was a crime, and it gnawed at him. He knew Crowley and Maddox were linked, and the banker's public humiliation would have made the outlaw furious. Maddox had lost his leverage and his anticipated payday from the foreclosure. A man like that would not simply walk away. He would be looking for his share, one way or another. One evening, 2 days after the scene at the bank, Eli followed a man he recognized as one of Maddox's less subtle associates. The man led him out of town, his horse moving at a steady pace toward the Badlands, a jagged spine of rock and shadow that the locals called Wild Dog Canyon. Eli kept his distance, a gray ghost in the fading light. He tethered his horse in a grove of cottonwoods and proceeded on foot, his limp a silent curse in the loose shale. The canyon was a natural fortress, a maze of high rock walls and narrow passages. He heard the low murmur of voices and the nicker of a horse from a sheltered alcove, hidden from the main trail. A campfire cast flickering, distorted shadows against the stone. Eli climbed a rock fall, his movements slow and silent, until he could peer down into the hollow. Whit Maddox was there, a big man with a dirty beard and cruel, restless eyes. He was talking to a smaller, nervous man whom Eli recognized as one of Crowley's clerks. Maddox's voice was a low growl of pure menace. He was telling the clerk that his boss had made a fool of him. He had a deal. The Hale property was supposed to be his compensation. Now that was gone, and he was owed. He wanted his cut, and he wanted it now. The clerk stammered, insisting that Mr. Crowley had no more funds to give, that the sheriff paying the debt had ruined the plan. Maddox laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He said that was Crowley's problem. He told the clerk to go back and tell the banker that the price of his health had just gone up. If the money was not delivered by the end of the week, He would start taking payment in other ways. Maybe he would start with the banker's fancy brick building. It was the proof Eli needed, a direct link, a clear threat. He began to back away, his mind already planning his next move. A loose rock shifted under his boot, clattering down into the darkness. It was not a loud noise, but in the tense quiet of the canyon, it was a gunshot. Instantly, the camp below exploded into action. Maddox roared a command, and two men scrambled up the rocks, their pistols drawn. Eli did not wait. He turned and ran, scrambling through the darkness, the uneven ground a treacherous enemy to his bad leg. A gun fired, the muzzle flash a brief, violent star in the night. He felt a searing, white-hot pain in his left shoulder, as if he had been struck with a branding iron. He stumbled, catching himself against a rock wall, the rough stone scraping his hands. Another shot whizzed past his ear. He pushed himself onward, driven by pure instinct, and ducked into a narrow crevice between two massive boulders. He wedged himself deep into the crack, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, listening as Maddox's men cursed and searched in the darkness outside. He waited, his shoulder throbbing with a deep, sickening rhythm, until the sounds faded and he was alone with the pain and the cold desert wind. By morning, the news was all over Pine Ridge. A deputy had found the sheriff's horse wandering loose and had raised the alarm. Eli had made his way back to the Hale Ranch under the cover of darkness, his shirt stiff with dried blood. The story he told the town was simple. He had stumbled upon Maddox's camp and exchanged shots. The official version, however, was quickly overshadowed by the one being crafted in the Dry Gulch saloon. Silas Crowley, seizing the opportunity to reclaim his public standing, was the chief author of this new narrative. He spoke to members of the town council, his voice full of faint concern. The sheriff was becoming reckless. He argued. He was provoking dangerous men, putting the entire town at risk, all because of a personal obsession with the widow Hale. He had spent his life savings on her, and now he was waging a private war in her name. The story was insidious, twisting Eli's act of duty into one of foolish passion, and his payment of the debt into a sordid purchase of a woman's affections. The town, already unsettled, began to divide. Some saw the sheriff as a hero, the first man to finally stand up to the outlaws who had plagued their territory for years. Others, swayed by Crowley's influence and their own cautious natures, saw him as a troublemaker, a man whose personal feelings were endangering them all. Abigail found herself at the center of this storm. The whispers followed her, more pointed now, more cruel. They said she had a hold on the sheriff, that she had driven him to this recklessness. She was no longer just the object of pity or curiosity. She was the cause of the town's new anxiety. One afternoon, when she went to the mercantile for supplies, she walked past the saloon. Through the swinging doors, she could hear the loud voice of Martha Gable, the proprietor's wife, holding court. Her words, sharp and clear, cut through the noise of the room. She was saying that for that kind of money, a woman ought to be able to keep her man at home and out of trouble. Abigail stopped. She could have kept walking, could have pretended she had not heard, but something inside her, a core of hard-won dignity, refused to bend. She turned and walked into the saloon. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her. She walked directly to the bar where Mrs. Gable stood, her face flushed with her own importance. Abigail's voice was quiet, but it was as clear and cold as a winter stream. She looked the woman in the eye. She said, "I am not for sale. Mrs. Gable, not for a sheriff's money, and not for the price of a quiet life." She turned and walked out, leaving a stunned, gaping silence in her wake. Back at the ranch, her brave front crumbled. The weight of it all felt crushing. She was bound to this man, Eli Barrett, by a debt of gratitude so immense it felt like a chain. Every time she looked at her home, at her cattle, at the land that was still hers, she felt the crushing obligation. She remembered the shame she had felt upon discovering Tom's secret ledger, the feeling of being unknowingly complicit in his weakness. Was this any different? Had she simply traded one man's secret debt for another's public one? The thought made her feel unsteady, her own sense of self eroding under the pressure. Eli, meanwhile, was fighting his own battles. The doctor had cleaned and bandaged his shoulder, pronouncing it a deep graze, but thankfully not serious. The pain, however, was a constant, grinding presence. He ignored it as best he could. He knew he was running out of time. With the town council wavering, he needed more than a story about an overheard conversation. He needed irrefutable proof. He went to the telegraph office, a small, quiet room that smelled of ozone and ink. Lyle, the young telegraph operator, was a nervous man, but honest. Eli questioned him gently, persistently, about any messages sent between Crowley and any known associates of Maddox. At first, Lyle denied everything, but under the sheriff's steady, unblinking gaze, his resolve crumbled. He finally admitted that yes, there had been messages coded and sent through a third party. He had kept the original flimsy copies, tucked away in a ledger, afraid of what they meant. He retrieved them for the sheriff. They were a damning trail of evidence, a series of threats from Maddox and evasive, terrified replies from Crowley, culminating in a final, desperate message from the banker sent the day after the fire. It read, "Patience. The situation is being handled. You will have your compensation." It was the nail in Crowley's coffin. Eli took the telegrams, a grim satisfaction settling in his gut. He had him. He had them both. He rode back to the ranch as the sky began to turn a strange, bruised purple. The wind picked up, howling with a new, mournful intensity. The air grew heavy and cold, the temperature dropping with alarming speed. Within the hour, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Not the gentle, drifting flakes of a light shower, but thick, wet, heavy snow that was driven almost horizontally by the wind. It was the first big storm of the season, arriving weeks early, catching everyone unprepared. By nightfall, the world outside the ranch house was a raging, white chaos. The snow piled up in massive drifts, burying fence lines and making travel impossible. Pine Ridge and the small ranch 2 miles outside of it were completely and utterly cut off from the world. Inside, Abigail stoked the fire in the kitchen stove, the warmth a small comfort against the fury of the storm. Eli sat at the table, the telegram spread before him. He had insisted on sleeping in the barn, but with the blizzard, it was madness. He had finally, reluctantly, agreed to take the small cot in the corner of the main room. She noticed he was shivering, a fine tremor that ran through his entire body despite the warmth from the stove. His face was flushed, and a sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. When he tried to stand, he swayed and had to grip the table for support. She went to him, her own anxieties forgotten. She placed a hand on his forehead. It was burning hot, the wound, the exhaustion, the cold from the canyon. It had all caught up with him. A fever was taking hold. For the next 2 days, the storm raged outside, and a different, quieter storm raged within the small house. Abigail became a nurse. She bathed his face with cool water, forced him to drink broth, and changed the dressing on his shoulder, which was red and inflamed. He was often delirious, muttering names and places she did not know, his usual stoic control stripped away by the fever. In those long, quiet hours, with the wind screaming outside the windows, something shifted between them. She was no longer the widow he had saved, and he was no longer the sheriff she was indebted to. They were just 2 people in a storm, one weak and one strong, bound by the simple, profound human act of giving and receiving care. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her touch gentle but sure, and he, in his vulnerability, accepted her help with a silent, complete trust. the lines of debt and obligation blurred, washed away by the intimacy of the sick room, leaving something simpler and much stronger in their place. The thaw came as abruptly as the storm. For 2 days the world had been a maelstrom of white, and on the third morning the sun rose into a sky of brilliant, aching blue. The temperature climbed, and the great silence of the snow was broken by a new sound, the steady, insistent dripping of water from the eaves of the house, from the branches of the cottonwoods. 1,000,000 tiny clocks ticking away the winter. Inside the small ranch house, the fever had broken. Eli Barrett was weak, his face pale and drawn, but the delirium was gone. He sat wrapped in a blanket at the kitchen table, sipping a broth Abigail Hale had made, his bandaged shoulder a stiff, painful reminder of his brush with death. The 2 days of the blizzard had forged a new kind of quiet between them, an intimacy born not of words but of shared vulnerability and simple, necessary care. The roles of rescuer and rescued, of debtor and benefactor, had dissolved. They were simply two people who had weathered a storm together. This fragile peace was shattered by the thunder of hoofbeats. A lone rider galloped into the yard, his horse steaming in the cold air. It was Deputy Miller, his young face flushed with urgency. He burst into the house without knocking, his news spilling out in a rush. The morning train, the first one through since the storm, had been stopped a mile east of the station. The payroll it was carrying, a month's wages for the railroad crew, was gone. It was Whit Maddox. The tracks in the melting snow were unmistakable. Eli was on his feet before the deputy had finished, the blanket falling away. A grim light had replaced the weariness in his eyes. He told Miller to ride back to town and gather any able-bodied man willing to face Maddox. He was to tell them to meet at the edge of town in 1 hour. Abigail watched him, a cold dread mixing with a fierce, protective instinct. She told him he was not well enough. His shoulder was still healing, and the fever had left him drained. He turned to her, his expression unyielding. He replied that Maddox would not wait for him to recover. He was using the melting snow to cover his trail. They had to move now, or they would lose him for good. As he checked his pistol and strapped on his gun belt, his movements stiff and pained, Abigail made a decision. It was a choice born in the smoke of the haystack fire and solidified in the long, quiet hours of the blizzard. She was not a spectator in this fight. It was her land they had threatened, her life they had upended. She told him she was coming with him. Eli stopped, his hand on the door. He told her absolutely not. It was too dangerous. She met his gaze, her own, just as resolute. She said that she knew this land better than any man in his posse. She had tracked lost cattle through canyons worse than Bitterroot. She could read a trail in mud and snow that they would miss. She was not asking for his protection. She was offering her help. He saw the steel in her eyes, the unshakable certainty. He knew she was right, and he knew in that moment that the woman who had cared for him in his weakness was as strong as any man he could deputize. He gave a single sharp nod. He told her to be ready in 30 minutes. Before they left, they made one stop. Sadie Quinn's mercantile was a hive of frantic activity, the whole town buzzing with the news. Abigail explained what they needed. Without a word, Sadie went into the back room and returned with a heavy wooden crate. Inside, nestled in sawdust, were 6 sticks of dynamite and a coil of fuse. It was left over from a mining venture that had gone bust. Sadie looked at Abigail, her eyes full of a fierce, worried pride. She told her to use it to close the back door on those sons of dogs. The posse was small, just 6 men including Eli. They were ranchers and a blacksmith, not gunfighters, but they were determined. Abigail rode beside Eli, her eyes on the ground, scanning the churned mud and melting snow. The trail was easy to follow at first, a clear path of multiple horses heading straight for the jagged maw of Bitterroot Canyon. Once inside the canyon, the real work began. The floor was a treacherous mix of slick rock, deep snowdrifts, and icy streams of meltwater. Here, Abigail's skills became indispensable. She pointed out a single, deep hoof print, almost invisible in the shadows, indicating a horse weighed down by a heavy saddlebag. She spotted a freshly broken branch high on a rock wall, a sign that the riders had taken a little-known upper trail, hoping to ambush anyone who followed. They moved with a tense, focused silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the heavy breathing of the horses. The canyon walls rose around them, sheer and oppressive, blocking out the sun. They were in Maddox's territory now, a place where he held every advantage. The first shot came without warning, a sharp crack that echoed like a whip through the narrow canyon. One of the ranchers cried out and clutched his arm, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. The air exploded with the roar of gunfire. Maddox and his men were dug in, firing from behind a barricade of fallen rock on a high ledge. Eli roared for his men to take cover. The next few minutes were a chaotic blur of noise and fear. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, whining through the cold air. The posse returned fire, their shots sporadic, aimed at the muzzle flashes from above. Under the cover of the gunfire, Abigail and Eli worked their way forward. Using the boulders for cover, they had to get closer. They found a narrow game trail that led up the side of the canyon, a steep, treacherous path that would bring them out behind Maddox's position. It was a terrible risk, but it was their only chance. They were halfway up when a figure appeared on the ledge above them. It was Whit Maddox himself. He was not looking at the posse below. He was looking at them. And he was not alone. He had Abigail. He had grabbed her from behind. His thick arm wrapped around her throat. The barrel of his pistol pressed hard against her temple. The world stopped. The shooting died away into a stunned, horrified silence. Maddox dragged her into the open, using her body as a shield. He grinned down at Eli, a triumphant, hateful sneer. He yelled, "Drop it! Sheriff, drop it! Or the widow pays the last of her husband's debt right now." Eli stood frozen, his pistol in his hand. He saw the terror in Abigail's eyes, but he also saw a flicker of something else, a fierce, defiant spark. Every instinct of a lawman screamed at him to find a way, to make a shot. But the man in him, the man who had sat weak and feverish in her kitchen, who had felt the gentle touch of her hand on his forehead, could not take the risk. Her life was worth more than any victory, more than any law. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his gun. He let it fall to the ground with a soft thud in the snow. He had made his choice. Maddox laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. He began to back away, dragging Abigail with him toward the horses. It was over. He had won. But he had underestimated Abigail Hale. She was no longer the woman who had stood helpless in a banker's office. She remembered a trick Tom had taught her once, a silly thing he had learned from an old prospector about how to startle a bear. Her hand, which seemed to be struggling against his grip, was slowly, deliberately reaching into the pocket of her coat. Her fingers closed around a small, smooth object, a shard of a broken mirror she used for signaling, and a handful of dirt and grit from the canyon floor. In one sudden, desperate motion, she threw the grit straight up into Maddox's face. At the same instant, she angled the mirror shard, catching a stray beam of sunlight that had pierced the canyon's gloom and flashing it directly into his eyes. For a single, vital second, Maddox was blinded. He roared in pain and surprise, his head jerking back, his grip loosening just enough. In that second, he exposed a sliver of his head from behind her own. It was all the time Eli needed. His hand blurred as he drew his second pistol from his belt. The shot was a single, deafening crack. It was not a killing shot. It was a shot of pure, calculated skill. The bullet struck Maddox's gun hand, sending his pistol spinning into the air. Abigail tore herself free, stumbling and falling into the snow as Maddox screamed in agony. The rest of the posse, seeing their chance, opened fire. The fight was over in a matter of seconds. The rest of the gang, their leader wounded and their position compromised, threw down their guns and surrendered. In the aftermath, they found the payroll bags, and tucked inside one of them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, black ledger. It was Maddox's account book. Inside, in neat, precise columns, were dates and sums, a detailed record of every dollar Silas Crowley had paid him for his campaign of terror against the ranchers of Pine Ridge. They had won, but the canyon was not finished with them. As they were tying the prisoners' hands, a low, deep rumbling sound started high above them. It grew into a deafening roar. A small section of the snowpack on the canyon rim, destabilized by the gunshots, had given way. It was not a massive avalanche, but it was enough. A river of snow, rock, and ice poured down the canyon wall, not where they were standing, but directly onto the narrow trail they had used to ascend. Their only way back down was gone. Buried under tons of shifting debris, they were trapped on the high ledge. Their only way out was up. There was a place, 100 feet higher, where the canyon wall was less steep. A place where they could climb to the rim and find another way back to the plains. Eli took the coil of rope from his saddle. It was their only hope. They anchored it to a solid rock outcropping, and one by one, the men began the slow, arduous climb. When it was Eli's turn, he started up with a grim determination. But the firefight and the strain of the climb had taken their toll. His shoulder wound, which had been a dull, throbbing ache, was now a blinding, searing pain. Halfway up, his grip faltered. His wounded arm gave out completely. He slipped, his body swinging wildly on the end of the rope, his boots scrabbling for a hold on the icy rock face. Abigail was already at the top, her hands raw from helping the others. She saw him falter, saw the flash of pain and exhaustion on his face. Without a second thought, she grabbed the rope above the anchor point, wrapping it around her hands, digging her heels into the frozen ground. She became his anchor. She leaned back, taking his full weight, the rope cutting into her palms. The other men rushed to help, but in that moment, it was just the two of them, connected by a single, straining line. He looked up at her, his face a mask of agony. She looked down at him, her voice clear and strong over the howling wind. She called his name, and as he met her eyes, she said the words that sealed the last of their debts. She told him, "I am not letting anyone fall again." With a surge of strength she did not know she possessed, she held the rope steady, her knuckles white, until the other men could grab it and help haul him, half conscious, over the ledge to safety. The ride back was a long, slow procession of the victorious and the vanquished. Maddox and his men were tied to their saddles. The payroll was secure. The black ledger was safe in Eli's saddlebag, but the sheriff was slumped forward, barely able to stay upright, his face pale as the snow around them. Just as they cleared the mouth of the canyon and the lights of Pine Ridge appeared as faint, distant stars on the prairie, he finally succumbed to the pain and exhaustion and fainted dead away in his saddle. Abigail rode up beside him, steadying him with one hand, with the other. She took the reins of his horse. She looked ahead at the town, the captured outlaws trailing behind her, the wounded hero beside her. The wind was cold on her face, but she no longer felt its loneliness. She was leading them all home. The return to Pine Ridge was a strange and silent parade. Abigail Hale rode at the head, holding the reins of Eli Barrett's horse, his unconscious form a dead weight in the saddle. Behind them, the deputized ranchers herded the captured members of the Maddox gang, a grim and sullen procession. The townspeople emerged slowly from their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe. They saw the prisoners. They saw the blood on the sheriff's clothes. And a new story began to form, one that had no room for the petty gossip of the previous days. The doctor, a stern man with gentle hands, took charge of Eli immediately. The bullet had done more damage than they realized, tearing through muscle, and the strain of the climb and the long ride back had pushed him to the edge of his endurance. As they carried him into the small infirmary, Abigail was left standing in the street, the reins still in her hand, the chaos of the last few hours suddenly replaced by an unnerving quiet in her own mind. Justice on the frontier was often swift and unceremonious. With the federal circuit judge not due for another 2 months, the town council convened an immediate hearing. The saloon was cleared of its tables, and chairs were arranged in neat rows. It was not a courtroom, but it would serve. The entire town crammed inside, their roles as gossips and speculators transformed into the more sober one of a jury of peers. Whit Maddox, his hand bandaged and his face a mask of bitter resentment, was the first to be brought before the council. He was no fool. He knew his own fate was sealed, but he was not a man to go down alone, especially not to protect the man he felt had cheated him. When asked to speak, he did so with a coarse, sneering pride. He confessed to the train robbery, to the arson at the Hale Ranch, and to years of extorting money from the local ranchers. And then, with a venomous glare in the direction of the back of the room, he named his partner. He told them everything. He detailed the arrangement with Silas Crowley, how the banker used him to create pressure on ranchers who were behind on their loans, softening them up for foreclosure. The Hale Ranch, he explained, was to have been his payment for a long and profitable partnership. A low, shocked murmur rippled through the crowded room. All eyes turned to Silas Crowley, who stood near the wall, his arms crossed, trying to project an air of indignant disbelief. When the council called his name, he strode forward, his face a mask of outrage. He called Maddox a desperate liar, a common criminal trying to blame a respectable citizen to save his own neck. He portrayed himself as a victim, a community leader who had also been threatened by this brute. He spoke of his own good character, his long standing in the community, the trust they had all placed in him. His voice was smooth, persuasive, and, for a moment, the town wavered. He was, after all, one of them. Maddox was an outsider, a known villain. It was then that Eli Barrett walked into the room, his left arm in a thick sling, his face pale but his eyes clear and hard as iron. He walked with his pronounced limp, leaning on his deputy for support, but his presence commanded an immediate and absolute silence. He did not speak. He simply placed the oilcloth-wrapped ledger on the council's table. He opened it, and the room watched as the council president, a hardware store owner named Peterson, read the neat columns that detailed Crowley's payments to the outlaw. Crowley's face began to lose its color. He stammered that it was a forgery, a crude fabrication. Then a second figure stepped forward, a young man so nervous he seemed to be trembling. It was Lyle, the telegraph operator. In his hand, he held a small stack of flimsy papers. He explained in a quiet, shaking voice that his conscience would not let him stay silent. He presented the telegrams, the undeniable proof of Crowley's complicity and his desperate attempts to control the monster he had helped create. The jury, made up of a dozen ranchers and merchants, the very people Crowley had lived and worked among for years, looked from the telegrams to the ledger, and then to the banker's ashen face. The truth was undeniable, and the sense of betrayal in the room was a thick, suffocating thing. The council did not need to deliberate. They declared Silas Crowley a disgrace to the community, stripped him of his position on the council, and ordered the bank closed, pending a full audit by the federal authorities who would be summoned on the next train. His personal assets were to be frozen, to be used as restitution for the victims of his scheme. For Abigail, the most stunning moment came when the council declared that a significant portion of that restitution would be used to compensate her for the damages from the fire and the attempted fraudulent foreclosure. The land that Crowley had tried to carve away from her in his charitable offer would be legally and formally returned, its deed cleared. In the days that followed, the town's opinion, which had been so fickle, swung completely. The whispers Abigail heard now were ones of admiration. She was no longer the stubborn widow or the sheriff's foolish cause. She was the woman who had faced down the banker, who had ridden with the posse, who had helped save the town from a predator in its midst. Martha Gable from the saloon offered her a drink on the house, an apology in a glass. Abigail accepted the drink with a quiet thank you, but she held the praise at a distance. She had not done it for their approval. She had done it for herself, for her home. Their good opinion was a welcome change, but she no longer needed it to feel her own worth. Eli was released from the doctor's care a week later, his arm in a plaster cast, his face still pale but with a flicker of his old, dry humor back in his eyes. He saw Abigail watching him as he awkwardly tried to button his coat with one hand. He managed a crooked smile. He said that bullets play no favorites, I suppose. It was the first time she had seen him so openly acknowledge his own vulnerability, and it felt more intimate than anything that had passed between them before. Her own internal conflict, the terrible weight of gratitude that had felt so much like a chain, began to ease. She watched him, this quiet, decent man who had been willing to lose everything for her, and she realized that his actions had not been a purchase. They had been a gift, freely given, and a gift did not have to be a debt. She understood, with a sudden, liberating clarity, that love, true affection, could exist alongside freedom. It did not have to be a transaction. 2 weeks after the trial, the first restitution payments were made. Abigail received a sum that was, to her, a small fortune. It was enough to buy the winter feed she had lost, to hire a hand to help with the repairs, and to start a small savings account, her own, in a bank in a neighboring town. She took a portion of the money, counted it carefully, and placed it in a canvas bag. That evening, she walked over to the barn, where Eli was still staying. He was sitting on a hay bale, trying to repair a piece of tack with one hand, his frustration evident. She stood before him, holding out the bag. He looked at it, then at her, his expression unreadable. She said, "This is for the debt, not all of it, I know, but it is a start." He did not reach for the bag. He just looked at her, his eyes searching hers. She took a breath, the words coming from a place of newfound certainty. She told him that gratitude has to be a size you can hold in your hands. Otherwise, it takes up all the room in your heart and leaves no space for anything else. A slow understanding dawned in his eyes. He saw that this was not about the money. It was about her need to stand on her own 2 feet, to be his equal, not his ward. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his tired eyes. He reached out with his good hand and took the bag. He said, "Thank you, Abigail, for keeping me a man and not a permanent benefactor." In that simple exchange, the last chain of obligation broke. The air in the barn felt lighter. The debt was gone, replaced by something warmer, something that felt like a beginning. As the first deep snows of winter settled in for good, Pine Ridge began to heal. To celebrate their deliverance, the town held a winter market in the main square. A huge bonfire crackled in the center, sending sparks up into the cold, starry sky. The sound of a banjo, lively and cheerful, filled the air. People laughed and talked, their faces rosy in the firelight. The rhythm of life, so long disrupted by fear and suspicion, was returning. Abigail and Eli stood on the edge of the crowd, watching the dancers, a comfortable silence between them. The wind was still cold, but for the first time in a long time, it did not feel lonely at all. The deep winter settled over Pine Ridge, a season of profound quiet and stark beauty. The snow fell in soft, thick blankets, muffling the world, burying the scars of the fire and the tracks of the outlaws under a pristine white peace. Inside the small ranch house, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Abigail Hale, with the first of her restitution money, had bought a new cast-iron stove. It was a magnificent thing, black and solid, and it sat in the heart of her kitchen, radiating a steady, bone-deep warmth that the old, drafty hearth never could. The kitchen became her project, her reclamation. She spent hours sanding and staining pine boards, which a neighboring rancher had helped her cut, turning them into simple, sturdy shelves. The scent of sawdust and varnish temporarily replaced the smell of baking, a sign of building before the comfort could settle. She arranged her few pots and tin plates on the new shelves, creating a sense of order and permanence that had been absent for so long. The room, once a place of lonely chores and anxious calculations, was becoming a true home, a nest being built against the cold. The constant whining howl of the prairie wind seemed less menacing now, held at bay by the solid warmth of the stove and the quiet purpose of her work. Eli Barrett was still there. The doctor had forbidden him from returning to his drafty rooms in town until his shoulder was fully healed. He had moved from the cot in the main room to the barn, insisting on the propriety of it, but he spent most of his waking hours near the warmth of the house. His presence was a quiet, steady thing, a part of the new rhythm of the ranch. He was a man unaccustomed to stillness, and the forced inactivity chafed at him. One bright, cold afternoon, Abigail looked out the kitchen window to see him attempting to chop wood. He had refused her offer to have the hired hand do it. It was a matter of pride. He stood before the chopping block, the axe held awkwardly in his left hand, his right arm still largely immobile in its sling. His first swing missed the log entirely, the axe head burying itself in the snow with a soft thud. His second attempt connected, but with a weak, glancing blow that sent a few splinters flying but left the log intact. A low curse, sharp with frustration, drifted on the cold air. Abigail pulled on her coat and walked outside. She did not offer to help. She simply stood and watched, a small, knowing smile on her face. He was aware of her presence but did not look up, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. He swung again, and again the result was pathetic. She spoke quietly, her voice laced with a gentle tease. She asked, "Is the wood that hard, Sheriff, or is it the heart?" He finally stopped, resting the axe head on the block, breathing heavily. He looked at her, his frustration giving way to a flicker of amusement at her boldness. He replied, "The heart is soft, Abigail. That is why the wood will eventually split." It was a simple exchange, but it felt like a key turning in a lock, opening a new level of ease between them. In the weeks that followed, they fell into a routine of shared work. He was limited by his injury, but he did what he could. They walked the fence lines together, the crunch of their boots in the snow the only sound. He would hold the posts steady while she, with her stronger hands, tightened and repaired the wire. She found a length of rope in the barn one day, a good lariat Tom had once prized. She watched Eli use a similar, shorter piece to fashion a temporary gate, his good hand quick and efficient with the knots. It made her think of the rope in Bitterroot Canyon, the line that had connected them, that had saved his life. A rope could be used to bind a calf for branding, to restrain and control, but it could also be a lifeline, a connection of trust. She felt that invisible line between them now, but it was not a noose of obligation. It was a tether of mutual reliance. The calves began to be born, small, steaming miracles in the cold air. They worked together in the barn, the sweet smell of hay and milk filling the space. Abigail would soothe a nervous mother cow while Eli, with his patient, quiet presence, would check the newborn. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, a partnership that needed no words. One evening, they sat in the warm kitchen, the scent of fresh-baked molasses cookies filling the air. The snow was falling again, soft, silent flakes drifting past the window pane. Outside, the world was a blur of white and gray. Inside, the stove glowed, and 2 enamel mugs of coffee steamed on the table between them. It was in this circle of warmth and safety that Abigail finally spoke of the things that had been locked away in her heart. She told him about her marriage to Tom. She spoke of his kindness, his big dreams, his love for the land. But she also spoke of the shadow that had always been there, the constant, gnawing fear of their debts. She described the way he would hide the mail from her, the way his moods would sour when a payment was due. "There was love," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But it was a love that was always being audited, always coming up short. I began to feel that love was just another kind of invoice, a bill that could never be paid in full. She looked at her hands, clasped on the table. Her greatest fear, she confessed, was that she would always be in some kind of debt to a man, whether it was one of money or one of the heart. Eli listened, his gaze never leaving her face. He did not offer empty reassurances. When she was finished, a long silence settled between them, filled only by the soft hiss of the snow against the glass. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He told her about the gunfight, the one that had given him his limp. He told her how, for months afterward, he had felt like a broken thing. He was a lawman who could no longer run, a man who could not stand as tall as the others. He admitted that he had thought he was half a man. The limp was a constant, public announcement of his own failure, his own vulnerability. It was his own secret ledger, a debt of pride he could never repay. Abigail looked at him, at this strong, quiet man who had faced down outlaws and bankers, and saw for the first time the depth of his own hidden wounds. Her heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming wave of tenderness. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his good one. Her voice was soft but clear and certain. She said, "Half a leg does not mean half a heart." Eli, his hand turned under hers, his fingers gripping hers tightly. They sat like that for a long time, their shared confessions a quiet absolution in the warm kitchen. The ghosts of the past, of debts and doubts, seemed to fade, unable to survive in the gentle light of this new understanding. Later, as they were banking the fire for the night, he stood behind her, his presence a warm weight in the room. He placed his good hand on her shoulder, turning her to face him. The air between them was charged, but it was not with tension or uncertainty. It was with a quiet, inevitable gravity. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was slow and deep and full of a profound, unhurried tenderness. It was a kiss of recognition, of arrival. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. He whispered the words that she had been waiting her whole life to hear, words that answered her deepest fear and set her completely free. He said, "There are no debts here, Abigail, not anymore." She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart against her own. A few days later, he found her on the porch, watching the gentle snow fall. He stood beside her, a strange hesitation in his manner. He started to speak, then stopped. She knew what he wanted to ask. The question hung in the air between them, the echo of his public proposal in the bank. But this time was different. The audience was gone. The duress was gone. She turned to him, her expression soft. She saved him the struggle of finding the words. She said, "Wait, ask me when you are no longer trying to protect me, but because you want to build a life with me. Ask me when you are sure you need a partner, not just a patient." He looked at her, a slow, relieved smile spreading across his face. He understood. He saw that this, too, was an act of love, her giving him the time he needed to heal completely, to become whole again, so that they could meet as equals, with no debts or dependencies between them. He nodded and reached for her hand. They stood together on the porch, watching the snow fall, 2 steaming mugs of coffee on the railing beside them. The world was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time full of a boundless and unencumbered promise. The winter broke, not with a sudden crack, but with a slow, gentle sigh. The great drifts of snow, which had seemed as permanent as the mountains, began to shrink, weeping themselves into the thawing earth. The prairie, a uniform white for so many months, began to show its true colors again. The pale brown of last year's grass punctuated by the stubborn, brilliant green of new shoots. The air, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, smelled not of ice and wood smoke, but of damp soil and the sweet, clean promise of new life. It was on such a morning that Eli Barrett asked Abigail Hale to ride with him. He did not say where they were going, and she did not ask. Since that quiet, snowy evening in her kitchen, their communication had often existed in this comfortable space beyond words. His shoulder had healed, leaving behind a puckered scar and a slight stiffness that he was stubbornly working to overcome. He had moved back to his rooms in town, but there was no distance between them. The invisible tether of trust, forged in crisis, held them fast. He led her up the long, winding trail to Holy Cross Hill, a high bluff that overlooked the entire valley. From its peak, the town of Pine Ridge was a small collection of wooden blocks, and her own ranch was a neat, distant square of fences and buildings. The great sweep of the plains stretched out to the horizon, and the sound of the wind was different up here, a soft, steady whisper that spoke not of loneliness, but of immensity. They dismounted and stood at the edge, the whole world spread out at their feet. The distant neigh of horses from a neighboring ranch drifted up to them on the warming air. They stood in silence for a long time, simply absorbing the peace of it, the feeling of having survived a long, hard winter and emerged into the light. Eli had his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over. Abigail watched his hands, strong and capable, the same hands that had held a gun with deadly accuracy and accepted her partial repayment of a debt with gentle understanding. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost lost in the vastness. He said he remembered standing on a hill like this once before. Years ago, after the gunfight that had given him his limp, he had felt like he was looking at a world that he was no longer fully a part of, a world that would always move a little faster than he could. He had felt, he said, like a debt owed to his own past. Abigail waited, knowing there was more. He turned to face her, his eyes the same clear, steady blue as the spring sky. The hesitation she had seen on her porch weeks ago was gone. In its place was a calm, profound certainty. He said, "There are no more debts between us. Abigail, only you and me." He took a breath, the simple, profound question filling the space between them. Marry me? There was no crowd. There was no bank. There was only the sky above, the earth below, and the quiet man standing before her, offering her not a rescue, not a repayment, but a partnership. A smile touched her lips, a genuine, joyful curve that came from a place of complete freedom. The fear was gone. The shadows were gone. She gave her head a slight, playful tilt. Her voice was light with a gentle tease that held all the warmth of their shared history. She asked, "Did you bring an invoice this time, Sheriff?" The corner of his mouth twitched, his own smile breaking through his seriousness. He shook his head, his eyes full of a love so deep it took her breath away. Her playfulness softened into the same sincerity that shone in his eyes. Her voice was serious now, a vow in itself. She said, "I will, Eli, if we promise to keep each other every single day." He did not have a ring, not a proper one. Instead, he took a thin leather cord from his pocket, a piece he used for mending tack. With his strong, practiced fingers, he braided it into a simple, sturdy loop. He took her hand, her palm rough and calloused from a life of hard work, and slipped the braided leather onto her finger. It was not gold or silver. It was a promise made of the very stuff of their lives, practical, resilient, and made by hand. It was perfect. When they brought the news back to Pine Ridge, the first person they told was Sadie Quinn. She was stocking shelves in the mercantile, her face set in its usual no-nonsense expression. When Eli, with a quiet formality, announced their intention to marry. Sadie's stern facade crumbled, her eyes filled with tears, a shocking sight in a woman so famously unsentimental. She threw her arms around Abigail, hugging her so tightly she could barely breathe. And then, to Eli's astonishment, she hugged him too, pounding him on his good shoulder with a resounding thump. She declared the wedding would be the town's business, and that her contribution would be a cake so large it would take 2 men to carry it. The news spread through the town like a welcome spring wind. The gossip now was not of debt and scandal, but of celebration. The community, so recently fractured by suspicion and fear, now had a reason to unite. Preparations began for a simple wedding, to be held in the small church, followed by a feast in the town square. The healing was not just for Abigail and Eli, it was for all of them. A few days before the planned wedding, a letter arrived for Abigail. It was from the federal penitentiary where Silas Crowley was awaiting trial. The handwriting was shaky, the words stilted and full of self-pity. It was a long, rambling apology, an attempt by a broken man to salvage some piece of his own shattered self-image. Abigail read it once, her expression unreadable. She did not burn it. Instead, she folded it neatly and placed it in the same tin box where she had found the telegraph receipt. It was not a token of forgiveness. It was a marker, a final, definitive period at the end of a long and painful sentence. That chapter of her life was now, truly, closed. But the land had one more test for them, one final challenge to prove that their newfound peace was built on a solid foundation. The spring thaw, so gentle at first, accelerated with a sudden week of warm weather. The snowpack in the high country, which fed the creek that ran past the town, began to melt with alarming speed. The creek, normally a placid, meandering stream, transformed into a raging, muddy torrent. It swelled over its banks and began to eat away at the earthen levee that protected the low-lying parts of the town. The warning came at dusk, a rider from an upstream ranch yelling that the water was rising faster than he had ever seen. There was no time for a formal plan. Eli, acting as the sheriff, and Abigail, acting as a rancher who knew the ways of the land, took charge. They did not give orders as much as they set an example. They were the first to arrive at the levee with shovels and empty grain sacks. Slowly, then all at once, the townspeople came, men, women, and even the older children, their faces grim in the flickering light of lanterns. They worked through the night, a frantic, desperate army fighting the rising water. They filled sacks with mud and rock, passing them down a long human chain, packing them against the weakening spots in the levee. The divisions of the past months, the whispers and the judgments, were washed away in the shared, urgent labor. The blacksmith worked shoulder to shoulder with the man who had gossiped about him. Martha Gable, her face streaked with mud, worked beside Sadie Quinn, their old rivalry forgotten. Abigail and Eli worked at the heart of it, their movements a synchronized, unspoken rhythm. They were not just fighting a flood, they were leading their community, binding it together with the simple, powerful act of a shared purpose. The levee was more than a bank of earth. It was a new boundary for their lives, a wall they were all building together against the floodwaters of the past. As the first light of dawn broke, cold and gray, the creek crested. For a long, heart-stopping hour, the muddy water lapped at the very top of their makeshift repairs. But the levee held. The water began to recede as the day wore on, leaving behind a wide swath of mud and debris. But the town itself was safe. In the exhausted, muddy aftermath, a new sense of community was palpable. They had faced a common enemy and won. They had saved themselves, together. A week later, the town gathered to build a new, sturdy wooden bridge over the creek where the old one had been weakened. As the men set the last plank, a group of children, released from the tension of the past weeks, ran laughing across it, their footsteps a happy, drumming beat. Eli stood with Abigail, watching them. The sun was warm on their faces. He put his good arm around her, pulling her close. His voice was soft, full of a quiet, happy certainty. He looked from the new bridge to her ranch, then to his own small house in town. He said, "I think it is time we built a bridge between our two houses, too." They did not get married in the church. They chose the backyard of the ranch, under the vast, open sky that had witnessed their struggles and now would witness their union. The entire town of Pine Ridge came, not as spectators to a drama, but as participants in a celebration they felt they had helped to earn. They brought with them benches from the church, long tables laden with food, and a genuine, unforced joy that was as bright as the late spring sun. The Reverend, a kind man with a weathered face, stood before them on a small rise, the prairie stretching out behind him like a great, green sea. Sadie's cake, a magnificent, multi-layered creation, sat on a nearby table, a monument to her fierce affection. A young ranch hand, who was surprisingly gifted with a banjo, sat on a bale of hay, softly plucking the mournful, hopeful notes of Shenandoah. Abigail wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, one she had made herself. She held a small bouquet of wild prairie flowers, their vibrant colors a testament to the resilience of life in this harsh land. Eli stood beside her, his good suit looking slightly out of place on his wiry frame. His arm was out of the plaster cast now, but he still held the shoulder a little stiffly. He was not wearing his gun belt. Today, he was not the sheriff. He was just a man, whole and hopeful, standing beside the woman he loved. As the Reverend began to speak the familiar, solemn words of the marriage ceremony, Eli leaned close to Abigail, his voice a low whisper meant only for her, a private amendment to the public vows. He said, "The first time I asked, it was in front of a crowd, in a bank filled with judgment. Today, I ask in front of the sky." She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his, a universe of shared understanding passing between them in that single glance. The memory of that day in the bank was no longer a shadow. It was a part of their story, the hard ground from which this beautiful, improbable flower had grown. She whispered back, her voice thick with an emotion so deep it had no name, "And I answer in front of my own heart." The promise between them was sealed, not with the weight of gold or the pressure of obligation, but with the simple, unshakable truth of two souls who had found their home in each other. The kiss they shared was gentle, a quiet confirmation of a bond that had already been forged in fire and snow, in fear and in faith. The celebration that followed was a joyous, noisy affair. The sharp tongues of the town, which had once dissected Abigail's life with such cruel precision, were now fully occupied with devouring Sadie's cake. Martha Gable, the saloon-keeper's wife, came up to Abigail, her face beaming, and declared it was the finest wedding Pine Ridge had ever seen, and that the sheriff was a lucky man. Abigail accepted the compliment with a simple, gracious smile, feeling no trace of the old sting. The town had not just changed its tune, it had found a better song to sing. In the weeks that followed, the last threads of the old life were neatly tied off. A team of federal marshals arrived and took a grim-faced Silas Crowley away in chains to stand trial for his extensive crimes. He was never seen in Pine Ridge again. Whit Maddox and his men were sentenced to long years of hard labor. Their reign of terror on the prairie finally and completely ended. Justice, which had seemed so distant and unattainable, had arrived, not with a sudden clap of thunder, but with the quiet, steady turning of the wheels of the law. One afternoon, a few days after the wedding, Abigail was cleaning out a small storage chest. At the bottom, she found the original foreclosure notice, the one Eli had taken from the bank. The stamped words "paid in full" were still stark and black against the page. For a moment, she thought of burning it, of erasing the last physical evidence of that terrible time. But she stopped. The fear was gone. The shame was gone. The paper no longer held any power over her. Instead, she took a simple pine frame she had built for a landscape painting she had never finished, and she framed the notice. She hung it on the wall of her new kitchen, the warm, bright heart of her home. It was not a reminder of a debt of money. It was a monument. It was a testament to the fact that the most important debts, the ones owed to fear and to hopelessness, could be paid. It was a receipt for a life she had bought back, not with coin, but with courage. That evening, their first as husband and wife in their shared home. The house was filled with the smell of roasting chicken and the comfortable silence of two people who needed no words. After they had eaten, Eli stood and held out his good hand to her. A slow, gentle melody from the banjo player at the wedding still echoed in his mind. He asked, "May I have this dance, Mrs. Barrett?" She smiled and took his hand, and he led her to the small, clear space in front of the glowing stove. He was clumsy. His shoulder was still stiff, and his limp, though less pronounced, made his rhythm uneven. She moved with him, her own steps sure and steady, supporting him, guiding him, the two of them finding a new, slightly awkward grace together. He winced slightly as he tried to twirl her, his arm not yet ready for such a flourish. He stopped, a look of frustration on his face. Abigail laughed, a soft, happy sound that filled the warm kitchen. She reached up and touched his face, her love for this good, imperfect man overflowing her heart. She said, "It is all right. We will just have to pay for this dance in installments." He looked down at her, the frustration melting away, replaced by a look of profound love and gratitude. He pulled her close, holding her tight, and they simply swayed together in the warm light of the lamp. A silent, perfect dance of two souls finally at peace. Dignity, Abigail had learned, could not be bought or sold. It was not a commodity to be traded in a bank or a saloon. It was a thing you built, day by day, with choices and with courage. It was tended with justice, watered with compassion, and held in the steady hands of love. The wind still blew across the high plains of Montana, a vast and indifferent force, a reminder of how harsh and unforgiving the world could be. But inside the small house, a single oil lamp burned, its warm, steady glow a promise against the darkness. It was a promise of a safe harbor, of a shared life, of a good and bountiful harvest yet to come. There were no more debts between them, only us. Thank you for being with us through this journey. Please comment below where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.